Welcome into Real Pod Wednesdays. I'm Dan Hope, joined by Andy Anders, and also joined this week by Kyle Jones, our X's and O's guru over at 11 Warriors. We had mentioned it on press coverage recently that we were going to have Kyle on the show soon to talk more about the new coaching staff, because Kyle certainly knows the scheme as well as anybody. Could probably talk in a little more detail about some of the schematic stuff these coaches are going to bring to the staff a little bit better than we can. So really glad to have you on the show this week, Kyle. Before we get into the new coaches and how that could all look for 2025, we haven't had you on the show since the CFP. So first of all, I wanted to ask you, just when you think back on that 4-game playoff run, just what impressed you the most about what Ohio State did during that run to a national championship?
Well, it's good to be back, guys. Good to talk to you again. Been a busy last few months, so I hope you guys are able to catch your breath right now. Things are going to pick up soon again, I'm sure. It's a great question, and candidly, like, the answer I'll give probably won't do it justice because of how memorable that 4-game stretch was. I'm sure not just for me, for you guys, and for all the fans, but there's just so much from a schematic perspective. But to boil it down, I think there's two things that I'll really remember first and foremost, and it really applies to both sides of the ball. It's the first 2 games and the second 2 games are 2 different stories. The first 2 games, it was put your playmakers in space. It was like the dream scenario that we've been looking at when you build the roster. It's the video game numbers. It's all that stuff where, all season long you wondered, hey, why aren't they pushing the Jeremiah Smith button enough? And why aren't they getting these talented running backs the ball in the right situations? Why aren't they just hitting Emeka Egbuka on 3rd down? Like, just get easy yards. And it felt like they really went for it offensively in that sense. And you could see the results where it was, we're going to be really aggressive and not, try to force the ball to our second string tight end just to spread things around and break tendencies. Like, this was not about breaking tendencies. Now it was time to push the gas pedal. And I think you saw that full potential of the offense when it was time to push the gas pedal down and not hold anything back in those first 2 games. The second 2 games, I thought situationally this team was excellent. They were prepared. It wasn't just that they executed, because you get a lot of teams that they'll play really well. They'll play really tough. It's the Lou Holtz. They held their water on 4th down, and there were this team had a couple goal line stands throughout the season, and certainly in that Texas game leading up to the Sawyer scoop and score. Like, that's toughness and all that, no questions asked. But like, they were so well prepared situationally. You hear Day talk about the 3rd and 11 to Jeremiah Smith, like a play that I think everyone will remember, who, certainly that was in the building that night, or, sober enough to be watching on TV at that point, shall we say. But like, they knew, I think he said on Tuesday before the game, like, they decided, if we're in a situation like this, we're calling this play and we're going to go after, we're going to go get one-on-one. And it was about the leverage. And I think, personally, one of my favorite things, and this happened in 2014 too, we still sell a t-shirt that I helped make the diagram for about 85 yards to the heart of the South, right? I got in an argument with Smart Football online about whether it was a pin and pull sweep or a buck sweep and all this and that. But for me, it was great back then. It's the same now, where we're talking about ball. We're talking about what happened between the sidelines. It's not, oh, well, Notre Dame only had 10 guys on the field. It's not, oh, well, it's their NIL. It's not those things. And so for me personally, obviously it was such a fun run to witness. But I love the fact that, like, you can talk to an Ohio State fan and be like, well, it was the cornerback's leverage. That's what allowed that play to happen, that magical play. And like, that's a dream scenario for a nerd like me to be like, yeah, let's talk about cover 1 leverage from a cornerback and how he pressed the hash marks to make that play happen. So that was probably the thing that I'll remember the most, was just those situations and how well prepared this team really was to take advantage in those moments.
Not to beat a dead horse, but what do you think it was that flipped from that Michigan game where the offense just looked broken to taking off the way you described in the CFP?
I think I truly think it's the mindset of the regular season versus the postseason. They were playing, and my cat's going to join the podcast. We got a special guest here.
Nice.
He's going to join in. We've got, this is Cosmo. But I think the thing to keep in mind here is, you've heard the team and Day talk about and allude to it. They never said it directly, but you can tell they knew they were getting in no matter what. And I think with Will Howard getting dinged up in that game and all that, I think it was truly like we can save some of our bullets in the regular season. And I think they felt that way, that they didn't have to press the pedal down, like I said, and really go for it because they knew they had that margin of error. And also they knew that they had that all that football still left to potentially play. And I think they were worried about that stretch run. And then when you saw the postseason start, the brakes came off. And suddenly it was like, all right, no more. Like we don't have this level, this level of cushion, and we've been waiting all year to get to this point. Now we're here. Now let's show everybody what we can actually do. And I think you saw the players play with a little bit more, I wouldn't say reckless, but more advanced. Like they seemed freer and granted they seemed more confident and pissed, candidly, but they also just, as my cat here, he's I'm here on this show. But like they you could tell like they were just playing so much freer and playing, to win the game versus to get through the game, which you kind of saw at times. And certainly in that Michigan game, there were stretches where you felt like those guys don't really love what they're doing right now. They don't love that they're playing in this cold ass game, getting, smashing the ball up the middle and hoping Will's okay. And I think that was that mindset shift that changed really that regular season versus playoff football that we're not used to in the college game, but we're going to start getting more and more used to.
I'm sure we could reminisce for hours about that playoff run and just how great that was for Ohio State. But kind of moving forward to obviously the coaches and kind of what is brought schematically by this. What were your initial thoughts when Ohio State decided to hire Matt Patricia? It's obviously been a little bit polarizing given some of his background, but what were your initial thoughts?
I mean, I think like everyone else, you go back to, wait, that's the guy who kind of bombed out with the Lions, and it kind of ended on a sour note, right? Not just like they lost football games, but you heard a lot about the relationship with players and things like that. And a lot of that, when if that's your only exposure and as fans, I'm sure, I know there's a lot of Lions fans who live north of Toledo that are loving the fact that Ohio State is hiring Matt Patricia because they could not think less of him, especially with what Dan Campbell did afterwards, right? It was a total 180 with that organization. So, if you're a Maize and Blue fan, like you're loving this. But I think that's also missing a little bit of the forest for the trees where that all the stuff that you hear about him and that was granted my initial reaction too was all that stuff that has nothing to do with calling a defense, right? And Dan can tell you firsthand how good his defenses were for so long in New England. And I think anybody that also knew anything about those Patriots teams, it's not like Bill Belichick was, calling the defense every week, for a lot of those teams. There's great famous stories about, he would spend his weeks with Brady, getting Brady ready, worrying about, this is what the opposing defense is going to do for, to you on the offense. And he would leave the defensive coaches to go do their thing. So, Matt Patricia is not like some like Andy Reid's assistants, for instance, that have that stigma of like, well, how much work did they really do? Andy's still in charge. I think with Matt Patricia, the goods are there. This guy was calling his defense every week. He was doing all those things. And, I think that's something that you're going to see cross over to Ohio State. And, you hear him talk about ball. This is a guy that loves football. I think that was the first thing that really stood out to me once I started digging into it. He's he's an engineer, went to RPI, studied aeronautical engineering. He's a smart guy when you hear him talk. And he's really interested, and this is, again, probably me nerding out. He's really interested in the history. In the past, when Ohio State's hired a new coordinator or a new staff member, I've written pieces for 11 Warriors where it's been, here's kind of the history of this system. Here's where it came from. Here's how it started all the way back when, right? And here's how it's evolved over the years. He loves that stuff. And you would hear stories from his players in the NFL talk about how every week he'd say like, hey, we're going up against this system. You got to understand the base foundation and the philosophies. And that's not to say, hey, great, Kenyatta Jackson's going to be a football scholar. Like, that's not why that's exciting. But I think it's a guy who he's not coming in married to a specific scheme. And I think that's the thing that I think was probably most appealing from Ryan Day's perspective is this is a guy who he kind of comes in with a fresh, schematic point of view of here's who we're playing this week. Here's the tools I've got at my fingertips. What can I assemble in that space? And rather than I need guys to fit in my scheme, and no, I'm not subtweeting Jim Knowles by saying that.
as you mentioned, I've watched a lot of Patriots games. I saw a lot of games where, this guy was calling the plays for the Patriots defense, and, they had a lot of success. And so, I think I probably have a more favorable opinion of this hire than a lot of people do. But I know for me, one of my initial reactions, and you and I have already talked a little bit about this off air, but one of the things that was always kind of a hallmark of the Patriots defense, I mean, not even just with Patricia there, but with Bill Belichick's entire tenure in general, was how variable the defense was from week to week based on matchups. The defensive scheme could look very different from one week to the next. And, I know there's a video that's been going around of an interview that he did recently with Julian Edelman. And even in that video, he talked about that process of every week, they're kind of looking at, okay, what do we do well? What do they do well? And then kind of building a scheme around, each matchup. And so my concern about that is how well will that translate to the college level? Because you get a lot more meeting time with your players in the NFL than you do in college. They're, 18 to 22-year-old kids versus pros. And so it's, I could just think back to, we've seen it over the years at Ohio State. I mean, I think back to when Jeff Hafley took over for Greg Schiano, and the big thing that everybody talked about, why did the defense get so much better, was because Hafley made things simpler. It allowed the players to play faster, whereas Greg Schiano was kind of running these very complex NFL-style defenses. Even this past year, after the Oregon game, one of the big things guys like Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau talked about with the changes that Ryan Day helped implement in the defense were we simplified things. We're playing faster. So my one concern is, will Matt Patricia overcomplicate things to where players won't be able to play as fast? Do you share that concern at all, Kyle?
I think it's a fair concern. I think it's a very technical question in the sense of simplicity comes in different forms. Like you can run 4-3, cover 3, when you open your Madden playbook and you press like, I want to run cover 2, boom, go. Like, yeah, that's simple. You're right. The simplicity does not come in the scheme you call from the huddle necessarily, or what you install during training camp. The simplicity comes in when you see something that you're not maybe expecting, or it's that one-off formation that that they do X when they line up this way, right? It's the Jeremiah Smith changes his feet, right? Let's talk, like everybody remembers and has heard that. We're talking about, another scheme thing from that week. They knew when Jeremiah Smith changes his feet, that means X, Y, and Z. And as a defense, you've got to communicate it. And you could see that corner from Notre Dame jumping and screaming and shouting and trying to get, because he's trying to communicate to all his teammates. That's when the simplicity comes, is making sure that, hey, when something happens out there on the field where I can't listen to the coach, we're not all huddled up and we can just talk like this. When I'm lined up across from my guy and something happens that I see and I know, oh my gosh, my responsibility's got to change. It's got to change right now. That's where simplicity comes in and understanding the communication. So, I've always thought, the schematic, yes, the schematic that Jeff Hafley, installed were simpler than the things that Greg Schiano and Luke Fickell were doing the year prior. That is true. However, they were doing things to make the game simpler for the players on the field when they didn't have the coaches able to communicate with them. And I think that's the part where, if you're Matt Patricia, and again, you hear about the way he's coached and you hear the way he just talks about football. There's a great video online of him at the Notre Dame high school, or at a Notre Dame high school coaches clinic, right? Ohio State has one every spring before the spring game. Notre Dame has one in the middle of the winter. And this was probably 7-8 years ago when he was still with the Pats. And he gave a talk there and doesn't really talk a whole lot about any specific schemes, but the way you just listen to him describe and teach football, you can tell this is a guy that communicates really well. Ryan Day is the same way, right? Where you can listen to Ryan Day explain a concept, and whether you barely know, you don't even know what a playbook looks like, you can kind of follow along. You can kind of understand. It's what makes the really good TV announcers what they do, and what makes Tom Brady, right? And that's the difference, is like those guys that are able to communicate. And I think Patricia's probably in that, but I think your concern is a fair one, Dan. How much is he going to try to put out there? And personally, my guess, because he's not a zealot for a specific scheme, he's not coming in trying to like make a name and show everyone how smart he is because he's going to win, win some games at Ohio State. The guy's got 3 Super Bowl rings as a DC. Nothing he does this year, sorry, Ohio State fans, is going to be higher than that on his resume. It just isn't, right? So he's not going to use this as a proving ground about how smart he is. What he's going to try to show is I'm able to adapt. I'm able to figure it out in these circumstances, which means I can try to put a lot on Caleb Downs' plate because he's a guy who's played a ton of football. He's been in these situations. He's a smart player from everything we hear. He's so instinctive. I'm going to put a ton on his plate, but I'm not going to maybe do that to Malik Hartford if that's who's starting next to him, right? This is a guy, how can I put a lot on Downs and Sonny Styles or Kenyatta Jackson and not be making life complicated for Caden McDonald? And I think that's the challenge that he's going to have to get through. And that's why you hire these guys before spring ball, even as we know spring ball is changing. Like, that's why it's so important, is not to necessarily install a playbook, but to understand what the tools are that those coaches are working with.
I think that leads well into the next question because, if you put your schematic hat on for a second, your Kyle Jones DC cap on here, with the multiple schemes that Patricia has in his background with all this, if you were picking a scheme for Ohio State to run next year, what do you think would fit the talent and the pieces that they have on the defensive side of the ball?
I think we're going to see a lot of cover 2, and I think it's going to be a lot of things that put Caleb Downs in the middle of the defense again. I think that is whatever happens down the road. I'm not even thinking about 2026, and Matt Patricia may be a one and done the same way Chip Kelly was, right? Like, I would very much expect that if he does well this year and things go well with the Ohio State defense, he'll be back in the NFL in some capacity next year. We're going to be having the same conversation about insert name as the new defensive coordinator for Ohio State. And that's fine, because I also think that the scheme is going to change when you lose number 2. He is such a special football player and what he brings to the table. I know Dan does the top 25 or the top 20 rankings, and every week this season, I would love to look back because I bet I put Caleb Downs number 1 every single week.
Pretty sure you did.
Because I mean, Jeremiah Smith's amazing, but Caleb Downs to me is like, he's the football player that every coach would build in a lab. Like, if you could play with 11 Caleb Downses, you would. And, especially on defense. And so you want to feature that guy. You don't want to say, hey, how can we cover up for so-and-so? Or how can we maybe get so-and-so some more sacks? Or no, you say, how can we make sure 2 has the biggest impact on this defense or on the game in every way? And so that's where I think taking a lot of the 3 high safety looks that we saw last year, which is why I think it's a big deal that Matt Guerreri is still around, even though he's the name that a lot of Ohio State fans may not know. He was the safeties coach last year, and he's had a lot of experience with that 3 high look. I think it's just going to be a lot of ways to get Caleb Downs in the mix. What you don't want is him dropping 30 yards downfield to play center field, because you're just kind of wasting that talent if you're having him play free safety. So that's really what I think schematically. I think that can take many different forms, and that's where if you're a Matt Patricia, in that video interview you talked about, Dan, it's a podcast you did with Julian Edelman, and they talk about Patrick Chung for 5 minutes. And, Patrick Chung, maybe you remember, maybe you don't, but you turn on the highlights of Patrick Chung, he's all over the place, right? And I think that's what you're going to look and see from the defense this year from Ohio State. I think you're going to get different ways of getting into that situation where Downs can be between the hashes and have his eyes on the football and not be turning his back and running, 30 yards downfield with a slot receiver. That's not helping Ohio State. Letting him have his eyes on the ball, letting him be, just allowing him to be fast and make plays and be an athlete. I think Sonny Styles is also going to get used very similarly. They're going to try to do whatever they can to take advantage of those 2 versatile talents. It's not a scheme. I'm sorry for not having a better answer there, but I think that's the philosophy. And I think schemes come when they're done right. A scheme is the output of a philosophy. And I think the philosophy for this team next year will be get 2 and 6 as involved in every play as possible.
You mentioned Matt Guerreri. I mean, I don't think any of us would be surprised if he is ultimately the insert name whenever Matt Patricia moves on 1 year, 2 years, whatever. I think we all expect he's going to have some role, in this defensive schematics as well, as will Tim Walton, both of them getting promotions to co-defensive coordinator and passing game coordinator. Now, the other question is up front. Was always the rumblings, and I think the way things ended kind of validated some of those rumblings about the push and pull between Jim Knowles and Larry Johnson and not quite seeing eye to eye in terms of how they wanted that defensive front to look. We've already talked about it. Matt Patricia is a multi-front guy. You would anticipate a Matt Patricia defense is not going to be strictly 4 down all the time. So when you think about how Matt Patricia will mesh with Larry Johnson and the rest of his staff, how do you feel like that's going to work out?
That's the biggest question I have on all this. I think the back end with the secondary is going to be the back 7 really will say. I think the linebackers of the secondary will be fine. I think there's plenty of toys for Patricia to play with there. I think it's not just 4 down versus 3 down or anything like that. I think it's the techniques, and this is really where the question about Larry Johnson comes in. One of the things that the Patriots always did, they were one of the few teams that kept playing what we call a 2-gap system versus a 1-gap system, meaning, or, even a gap and a half was the thing that Vince Wilfork basically invented, which means, yes, I have the B gap, but I'm also going to play and this guy over here's got the other B gap or the other A gap, and then together we're going to play the middle A gap between us. That sounds confusing and difficult, and it is. And it's really hard to do that kind of stuff. You rarely see that at the college level. You see it from the good Saban teams, the really good Georgia teams, right, that had basically what is now the Philadelphia Eagles front sevens. Like, they would do that kind of stuff because they had freaks. And it doesn't mean Ohio State doesn't have talent up front, but you got to teach it. And it takes a while to teach that kind of thing. So I think the real question is not just will he run it. It's not a question of will he run it. It's can they teach it, and how much of Matt Patricia's time is going to be taken up teaching that versus the teachers that are already in the building. Right? Is that something that they can trust Larry Johnson, a guy who's been a 4-3, a 4 down, 1 gap, get up field type coach for a long time? He's had so much success with it, but this is just a different style. And it literally means teaching and doing different drills and repping things differently. That's the big question. Now, if Larry stays on, I'm sure he's capable of and understands how to do a 2-gap. There's no doubt about it. I'm sure he could talk about it for hours longer than I could. But he's just never been asked to lead a defense that does that. And I think that's really the thing is can Patricia trust him, or is Patricia going to need to spend a lot of his own time doing that versus looking at the broader picture? And I think that's really, we're not going to know until probably October, candidly, what the answer to that question looks like.
It's funny because I played nose guard in high school, and we ran a 5-2 for a couple of years. So I was doing some 2-gapping back in the day, just a little bit, not at the level that these guys can. Certainly, I don't think a 5'10" lineman is matching up in a Patricia's scheme, but you brought back some memories with that one.
I'm sure. The two gaps alive and well in a few random places. It pops up here and there, and the high school coaches I talk to hate when they see it because they don't see it very often because it's hard to implement because you need the right guys.
Absolutely. But, kind of wrapping out the discussion on Patricia, just how much carryover do you expect in what he's going to do with what Jim Knowles did? Obviously, a lot of the same coaching staff pieces are coming back around Patricia, but you're replacing a whole wave of the talent of that defense outside of maybe the most important piece, like you said, Caleb Downs. So how much carryover do you expect from the Jim Knowles scheme to the Patricia scheme?
Well, I think it's gonna have to look different simply because of the players that are there. You don't have that same talent along the defensive line, at least not yet. That you can rely on. As much as coming into the season, even up until probably the playoff, people would have said that front, that defensive line for Ohio State hasn't lived up to its potential. Like, they certainly made good at the end of the day and really carried that defense through the playoff in a lot of ways, right? That those front four created so many problems. And they're all going to get drafted on day 2, if not sooner in the draft as a result. And you're just going to have to replace those bodies. And I think that alone, I think not having Lathan Ransom is going to be a huge gap to fill. I think that he, as much as everybody knew about Downs, I think Lathan Ransom was maybe somehow an unsung hero on that defense. He just made everyone correct in the same way. Everyone probably remembers him just that pop he laid on Jordan James to come down and run defense again, in the Rose Bowl that basically took Jordan James out of the game. That's a guy that you can't, you rely you're going to be able to just replace. And so to answer your question, I think you're going to have to look at the skill sets and you're going to say, well, we've got two corners who have played a lot now. And obviously Igbinosun and Jermaine Matthews has played a lot of football at this point. And I think we can see the talent that's there. I wouldn't be shocked if we see a lot of man coverage, especially the first half of the season, because they're just going to say, we're going to rely on those guys that have played a lot and just let them go be them, right? And let them do their thing. We don't know what kind of pass rush we're going to have yet. Kenyatta Jackson's played a lot of football, but he hasn't necessarily had a ton of production. I think he's a good player, but there's a lot of questions everywhere else along, that defensive front. And then I think you can rely a little bit on the linebackers now. Reese played a good amount. Obviously he's not Cody Simon, but you've got Sonny Styles who can do a lot of different things. So, I'm not answering your question directly, saying we're going to run we're going to see a lot more cover 4 or anything like that. But I do think that especially early on, you are going to see a lot more man just because they're going to just say, let those corners do their thing. We'll let the other 9 deal with everything between the numbers.
Now, as we flip it over to the other side of the ball, of course, a new offensive coordinator as well. As you mentioned, Chip Kelly no longer at Ohio State. Ryan Day going with an in-house promotion for offensive coordinator this time around, naming Brian Hartline the offensive coordinator. He is going to give him the keys to the offense this time. Brian Hartline was technically the offensive coordinator 2 years ago, but Ryan Day was still calling the plays. Now the plan is for Brian Hartline to call the plays. Kyle, just what are your thoughts initially on that move? Do you think that's the right decision? Do you think Brian Hartline's ready for this?
Well, I think he's been around, and I think he's certainly earned the opportunity. He's certainly been involved with the passing game, and they've got a core now there as well between Day, Hartline. Keenan Bailey's been there forever as well, and also one of those more unsung heroes, I think, of this system, and getting them into the right game plans. I think this is one of those things where what do we mean by play caller and what do we mean by offensive coordinator? Because I think those are those are distinct terms in my eyes at this point. Because I do think we saw in the playoffs, and I talked about a little bit at the beginning, the situational preparedness, the being able to design up. It's not like they just said, all right, hey, we've been trying to avoid throwing to Jeremiah. Now this time you're allowed to throw to Jeremiah. It's not like that's the conversation. It was, we're going to scheme ways to get Ford the ball. We're going to scheme ways to get Ibuka the ball. We're going to scheme ways to get Trey and Q and all those guys the ball in advantageous places. And that's what Ryan Day for so long has been so good at. You hear, I think Klatt has talked about it every single game that he's done for Ohio State this year. Joel Klatt would say, he's the best play caller in college football, and he gave up calling plays. And it's like, yeah, he did. But you think he wasn't there to game plan? Because I'm pretty sure he was still the one, there Sunday through, Friday, putting together the game plan and overseeing it, hence the very infamous, I'm going to go spend some time with the defense now. What do you think he was doing before that? What do you think he did after that? Do you think he was just, having tea and calling recruits? Like, no, man, he was still running the offense. And I think that's what's still going to happen. Is I think this is still going to be systematically the same offense, which now Hartline knows as well as anybody, right? And I think what the value is you can say, all right, Brian, you know how this system works. You know what the machine looks like. You and Keenan can probably put together a game plan for a lot of the, some of the non-conference outside of Texas. You guys can just go do that. But what he's going to be able to do there is say, all right, when we are playing Texas, when we are playing Penn State, Michigan, those teams, you're going to probably see a little bit more of that Ryan Day flair, if you will. We saw it again in the playoff, all those games. It was like, how is he so open? Well, you had a really good offensive mind coming up with, helping with the game plan. Whether it was Chip, who was actually, and this is what I mean by the play caller, whether it was Chip, who was on the radio telling Will Howard those things, or Ryan Day, is a little bit different, right? And that was one of the things I was argued about leading up to last season was, Ryan Day needed to kind of get out of that literally being the one to call in the plays to have more awareness of what was happening in the game and game flow and game management, things like that. It didn't mean that I didn't think he should be involved in the offense anymore. And I don't think he's going to be hands off by any stretch of the imagination. And I think it also probably is a big reason why you saw Matt Patricia get the defensive coordinator job versus someone like Matt Guerrieri just get promoted, right? I think that those two things are connected. And it's so that Ryan Day can still be much more hands-on with the offense and trust someone to handle the defense where he can be a little bit hands-off when he needs to be.
Brian gave the indication that during the playoffs, he was being a lot more hands-on. He was involved in those meetings. And to your point, I think his presence was always there, and it was always still in many ways a Ryan Day offense that we saw in 2024, even if he came off the radio, so to speak. How much influence do you think that had on the Brian Hartline hire, and how hands-on do you expect Ryan to be this season with Brian, coaching him up as it's his first time calling those plays?
And as someone who's not in the meeting rooms, this is my estimation, is in the coaches' meeting rooms, right, where they're talking about what do we want to run this week? What are we seeing on film? What are the tendencies that we know? What do we know about this team personnel-wise? Who are the people that we're most worried about? I think those are the meetings where Ryan Day is still going to be running things. Where I think he probably takes a step back and allows Brian Hartline that space is when they get out on the practice field and someone's saying, "Hey, we're going to run XYZ play. We're going to run spread from a tray look, and we're going to flip the H and the Z in this and blah blah blah." That's going to be Brian Hartline. It's not going to be Ryan Day. Ryan Day is going to be standing on the sideline, being the CEO. And I think to the players, it'll feel like, yeah, Coach Hartline's the guy talking to me. Coach Hartline's the offensive coordinator. Because that's what we heard, Will Howard talk about his relationship with Chip Kelly the same way. I think that's what we'll see. But I think you'll also see that influence, especially in those bigger games, where it's, hey, we're playing a really good defense. We're playing Jim Knowles in a Penn State defense that is trying to win a national championship. We've got to bring our A++ game. Ryan Day is going to be involved in that game plan. Like, full stop. I bet my house on that.
That's going to be a fun chess match, isn't it? Ryan Day versus Jim Knowles in the shoe in November. I think we're all really looking forward to watching that one. Ohio State staying in-house with the offensive coordinator hire, but making one new addition to the offensive staff by bringing in Tyler Bowen, who was the offensive coordinator at Virginia Tech. Now he's going to be the offensive line coach and run game coordinator for the Buckeyes. Do you think that will have much influence on this offense in 2025, or do you think he's mostly just coming in to coach the offensive line?
I think it's probably more of the latter. Candidly, I don't see the system changing a whole lot. I mean, we saw a bunch of run game wrinkles when Chip Kelly came in, right? And I love diagramming them the first, half, 2/3 of the regular season. And then they kind of went away. And it was because it was like, yeah, it's a nice to have. But really what we learned is that, this an offensive line is much more about chemistry. It's about reps. It's about trust. And I've always believed this too, that like there's no right or wrong scheme from a run game. Yes, novelty for someone like myself who spends a lot of time talking about it. It's fun to talk about a center pulling instead of the guard and bringing a wide receiver to be a lead blocker. That's fun. But it's not like one scheme is objectively better than another. And it's really just about how you're able to coach it. And I think that's going to be Bowen's, task here. He does bring back, he's got a fairly, full cupboard, I would say. I think the offensive line is actually going to be a strength of this team this year, especially on the interior. It's like weird to say just a few months departed from a point where we were all so, talking about it every week, like, can they get it together? And now we're going to be looking at it going, hey, you've got Tiger Shabola and Carson Hinsman and, Luke Montgomery and Austin Terrible, which I don't know what you're going to do between those four. That's a lot of games played that with some good football, and suddenly you're going to be able to lean on that plus the 2 transfer tackles. Like, it's a really good situation for Bowen to be coming into, which is why I don't see him coming in and saying like, hey, I've got all these different schemes in my special playbook. Let's change things up. It's going to be let's keep going with what's been working and make sure that we're putting, whoever's back there at quarterback, probably Julian Sayin, let's make sure he's got enough time to throw to number 4, number 17.
Yeah, we all know I love me some offensive line talk, and I really think it is going to be the more important side of that is going to be the development and the recruiting for Tyler Bowen. When you talk about like getting that line to coalesce, and they don't have a lot of depth out there at tackle either, so they're going to have to figure it out with Onionwa and Daniels likely, unless Ian Moore makes a surprise run. So that side of it does seem to be, I agree with you there, that Tyler Bowen is definitely more focused on just the position. Having said that, looking elsewhere on the offense, obviously Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate come back. With the turnover on the offensive line, I think we'd all agree the backfield, as much as I like James Peoples, isn't going to be as strong as it was last year when you had two of the best in the country with Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins. Tight ends might be a strength, though. I mean, there's definitely some rotating personnel for Ohio State on that offense. Just how do you see what this team might tweak, what this team might change in its scheme, even though it will be the same system with Ryan Day? It's going to be molded to the players as he's done over his career.
Yeah, I think the biggest change is going to be the quarterback run game. I mean, everyone saw this year what a difference it made having Will Howard there and that big frame, even though, he got eaten by the turf monster a couple times on those big runs, he was still so useful on short yardage. Not just because he was big and hard to tackle, but because he just, you could trust him as a ball carrier, and then you got that extra gap. I'm sure every time they did that, Urban just, smiled from wherever he was watching from on the big noon set, right? It was JT Barrett all over again. That's not going to happen with Julian Sayin back there. And if Lincoln Kienholz does somehow win the job, then maybe you see a little bit more, but even still, he's not 6'5", 240, the way that Will Howard is. And so I think that's probably the biggest question I have schematically about this offense. There's so much firepower in the passing game of it, as you just laid out. I think tight end is going to be a strength of this team with both Max Clare and Will Kesmerick there. Like, that's a strength. You've got, the other guys that are coming back. Running back, sure, probably won't be as strong. I think it'll be serviceable. You won't have the home run hitting ability of a Trey Henderson or a Quinshon Judkins, but when you add a bit more veteran offensive line, it might balance out kind of in the wash that way. But it is truly what's going to happen on, 3rd and 2 against that Penn State front. What are you running? And the scheme's going to look different because you can't just say, we're going to run quarterback power like we did 6 times in the national championship game against Notre Dame, right? Like that was a game changer. And so I think that not having that in the toolbox is a big question of how do you replace it effectively.
How do you think they get around that? Because I totally agree with you. That's one of my biggest concerns with this offense is potentially, I mean, you look at Julian Sayin, he's not that big a guy, and we've saw it in the past with C.J. Stroud. I mean, C.J. Stroud could run. They just didn't want him to. If they take that same approach with Julian Sayin, which they might, how do they make up for that?
I think this is the new schematic argument of football coaches on Twitter in the year 2025. For anyone who wants to join, it is the disappearance of what we call the quick game, 3-step passing game, right? You watch those old 49ers teams, you watch the NFL anytime in the 90s, it was quarterback takes a snap, 3 steps, boom, throws a slant, throws an out, throws a hitch, throws a quick pass right away. It's all timing based, right? And that's why they, everyone started playing, off coverage. They started pressing up, and that it just changed the way the game was played. And now you don't see it very often. It's hard to teach at the high school level, so kids don't run a ton of, especially compared to RPOs, which is a lot easier to just say, should I throw the bubble screen or should I hand it off? That because especially at the high school level, that's pretty much the same. And at a lot of college levels, it's about the same. And it's easier to teach, easier to run. It's a lot harder to get the timing, and it's a lot harder to run those routes. But when you've got 2 superstars in 4 and 17, especially 4, who cares what Lou Holtz says? Throw him the ball. Like throw him a slant on 3rd and 2. Like, it's okay to throw him a slant on 3rd and 2. No one's going to question your manlyhood or the toughness of the program when he's running through the secondary for a touchdown. Like, that's the thing that I think this offense and I hope the fans can get past. It's like, well, I wish they would just hand it off to James Peoples between the tackles. That's what Woody would have done. Yeah, maybe, but this isn't then. So Woody never had a guy like Jeremiah Smith. Woody would have had him playing defensive end. So, you have that guy, use him. You've got a 5-star, number 1 ranked quarterback, whatever, in Julian Sayin, use him. don't just have him turn around and hand the ball off on a critical play.
Kyle
off my soapbox.
Then Kyle should have worn his Frova damn ball shirt for Viva's podcast.
Yeah. Exactly. Like next year, yeah, man. Like get back to like this. Like this is a year for the Dwayne Haskins, CJ Stroud. Like, why can't they just run the ball? Well, because they're throwing for 5,000 yards. That's why. That like it is what it is. This is how it works. So I do see it being a lot of like quick 3-step game, 3-step drop, slant, double slants, hitch out, things like that. That's what will replace it. And once you start doing that, especially if you start doing that early on in the year, and that becomes your tendency, what you don't see as much is 9-10 guys in the box. Suddenly you see 7 or 8, and then you can hand it off to James Peoples off the left guard behind your talented interior offensive line, and that becomes a lot easier. It's all cyclical. Anyway.
Very valid points made by the soapbox stand from Kyle, because it just you have all these weapons. We've talked about it for years. If there's no time to really sell out in the passing game, then the next year with a quarterback who's not going to run the ball as much and with not as highly touted backfield, I think we're in agreement with you there, Jones, that next year's offense should be a pretty passing oriented one.
Well, it's going to be a fun year to watch Ohio State football for sure. We're certainly going to be looking forward to watching all your film studies, Jones, and everything you're going to be doing, breaking down Ohio State football once again for us over at 11 Warriors. So thanks so much for taking the time to join us, Kyle. We really appreciate it.
Always fun to talk ball with you guys. Good to see you.
And for everybody else out there, we'll be back next week for another episode of Real Pod Wednesdays. So we hope you join us then.